What is up, my friend? Welcome to the basement. I am Mikey Henninger, and this is Basement Brood Fantasy Football. Thank you so much for being here. Seriously, every time you tune in, you're helping a kid chase his childhood dream. And I shouldn't even say kid. I'm a 33-year-old grown man in his basement talking about fantasy football. But you're here. You think you're listening. You're just listening to a podcast, and really, you're helping a guy chase his childhood dream. So seriously, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode 2 of the Basement Brood Fantasy Football Podcast. Episode 1 was fun. It was heartwarming. It was the story of how this all began. But I think it's time we get into the nitty-gritty. I think it's time we get into some fantasy football. So I've been in the basement working hard on fantasy football previews for all 32 NFL teams and every single fantasy football relevant player on every single team. And over the course of the next month, maybe month and a half, I will be releasing those articles and I will be turning them into episodes here on the podcast. So whichever way you choose to consume your content, listening, watching, reading, I got you covered. Stay tuned over the next month, month and a half. There's a lot more coming. But first up, I thought it would make sense for us to start with the Super Bowl favorite Buffalo Bills. Yesterday, I published the write-up on my website. I left a link to it in the description of this podcast below or above or wherever you're listening or watching. It should be below the description, but the link is in there. If you can't find it, or if I don't know what I'm doing, go over to basementbroodff.com and click on content, and it'll be the first thing you see. It's got the Buffalo Bills, red and blue. Can't miss it. My ugly design is the cover image, so you'll see it. You won't be able to miss it. And if that doesn't work, you can head over to my Twitter, at BBFFMikey. I've been promoting it relentlessly. I'm sure my followers have heard enough about it, but there's 3 different ways for you to find it. The written version is on the website. Go check it out. So before we get into where the Buffalo Bills are going, my good friend Mater from Cars, what did he say? He said something like, you can't think about where you're going until you've thought about where you've been. And it's super wise, super deep. I think I butchered the quote, but fellow dads, fellow moms, you know what I'm talking about if you've ever watched Cars. Before we look at 2022, let's take a look at the Buffalo Bills 2021. None of this is going to be a surprise to you. You already know that the Bills are one of the most potent offenses in all of football. There's a reason that they're the Super Bowl favorites this year. Last year, they averaged just over 28 points per game, which was the 3rd most in football. They averaged nearly 382 yards per game, which was the 5th most in football. They ran just over 67 plays per game, which was the 3rd most in football. They threw the ball 38.5 times per game, which was the 5th most in football. They ran the ball 27.1 times per game, which was the 13th most in football. And they scored on 45.2% of their offensive drives, which was the 5th best clip in the game. Now, 2022 doesn't seem likely to be all that different. In fact, the next decade doesn't seem likely to be all that different, as the Bills have Josh Allen for the next decade, a young quarterback who's still ascending. When we look at 2022, the Bills have the best odds of winning the Super Bowl, according to Vegas. They have the best odds of producing an MVP, Josh Allen. And most importantly for fantasy football reasons, they are the most likely team to lead the league in scoring by far. Vegas gives them the best odds, and it's not even close. Once again, the Buffalo Bills are the team to target in 2022 fantasy football. Now, they did technically lose some offensive firepower. They lost Cole Beasley. They lost Emmanuel Sanders. They lost Brian Daboll, the offensive coordinator, who's now the head coach of the New York Giants. But they also replaced all of those options. So when they lost Brian Daboll, they promoted Ken Dorsey, who served the last 2 years behind Daboll. So he's just going to bring the same offensive scheme and theme that the Bills have already been running. Not really any changes there or expected changes. They brought in Jameson Crowder to play the Cole Beasley role, who you could definitely argue Crowder's even better suited for the Cole Beasley role than Cole Beasley is. And they also brought in dynamic rookie James Cook, who's arguably the best receiving back in this year's draft class. They brought in O.J. Howard, who, of course, he'll be behind Dawson Knox, but we know he could be a threat in the passing game. And they did bring in Duke Johnson, who may or may not be on the roster come September, but we know that's another potential receiving threat if he gets some work on third down, but likely that would be at the expense of James Cook. Anyhow, perhaps more importantly than any of that, this means that they're going to get Gabriel Davis on the field as a full-time player, and if you've watched Gabriel Davis in the last 2 years, that's an exciting idea to get him on the field full-time. So, all in all, I don't expect the Bills' offense to miss a beat. They likely, I think it's perfectly within the realm of possibility that they're an even better offense than they were last year, and they're already near the top of that mountain, so that's going to be tough to beat, but no reason to think they're in for any sort of decline. So let's dive into the individual players, starting with the apparently soon-to-be MVP, according to Vegas, and I can't say I necessarily disagree, Josh Allen. He's already been a stud over the last 2 seasons, right? 2 seasons ago, he was the QB4, averaging just about 25 fantasy points per game. And last season, he was the QB1, averaging just about 24 points per game. Last season, he had the 4th most passing attempts, 7th most passing yards, 6th most passing touchdowns, 3rd most rushing yards, 3rd most rushing attempts, and 3rd most rushing touchdowns. He's played in 32 fantasy football games over the last 2 seasons. And when I say fantasy football games, that means he's played in weeks 1 to 17, which is when we're playing fantasy football. So he's done that 32 times, and in those games, he's scored at least 20 points in 65.5% of his games. And he's scored 30 or more points in 31.2% of his games. Now, for comparison, know that no other quarterback, not Tom Brady, not Aaron Rodgers, not Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, nobody has hit 30 or more fantasy points in even 27% of their games in the last 2 years. And Josh Allen is hitting 30 points in 31% of his games. So once again, he's been the greatest over the last 2 seasons, especially when it comes to, those high upside games. Again, excuse me, he's lost Cole Beasley, he's lost Emmanuel Sanders, but he gained Jamison Crowder, he gained James Cook, Gabriel Davis is going to be on the field more, he's got the best odds of winning MVP, he's got the 6th best odds of leading the league in passing yards, and again, the Bills have the best odds by far, it's not close, and I can't emphasize that enough, that the Bills have the best odds of leading the NFL in scoring. That's a big deal in fantasy football where what do we want? Touchdowns. When do we want them? Okay, you get it. Josh Allen, clear-cut QB1. I don't think it's particularly close. I don't think it's particularly debatable. Josh Allen is the QB1. Now, the problem is he's priced that way. He's being drafted that way. In DraftKings, he's being drafted around pick 17, which is in the middle of the 2nd round, which is very high. Frankly, it's too high for my taste. I will be passing on Josh Allen in the 2nd round. Not saying he's not worth it. We know he's the quarterback this year, but it's hard for me to stomach taking a guy like Josh Allen when there's guys like DeAndre Swift, Aaron Jones, Keenan Allen, Mike Evans, Saquon Barkley, all those guys are still on the board. So it's hard for me to stomach taking a quarterback, even if it is Josh Allen there. He's a little bit cheaper on underdogs. He goes around pick 30, which is in the middle of the 3rd round. Still on its own, too rich for me. But if I've taken Stefan Diggs in the 1st or 2nd round, then Josh Allen becomes an auto draft for me in the 3rd round so that I can stack the two. Speaking of stacking, you can also target Gabriel Davis around pick 50 on underdog or 60 on DraftKings. Personally, I think that's too rich for Gabriel Davis, and we'll get to that in a minute. You can also target James Crowder, who goes pick 131 on underdog, and he goes pick 167 on DraftKings. Much cheaper, and I think he's actually one of the biggest values in fantasy football this year. You could also target Dawson Knox, but I don't recommend him as a fantasy football player at all this year, and we'll get to that in a minute, but you could also aim for stacking him if you do take Josh Allen. So, Josh Allen, overall QB1, no denying that. However, he's priced that way, and he's a little bit too rich for my taste, but if you have him in dynasty leagues, for example, man, you're already sitting pretty heading into 2021. Heading over to the running backs. So if you've played fantasy football or paid attention to football over the last 2 years, then you know, or last few years, then you know the Bills haven't really had any dynamic one running back. There's not really been anything that's been exciting about their running back room, right? They've had Devin Singletary, who 2020 he finished as the RB43. He got about 9-ish PPR points per game. Last year he did better. He finished as the RB34, so a low-end flex option, averaging just shy of 11 PPR points per game. So he's been fine. He's on the radar in fantasy football, but he's not what you would expect for one of the best offensive units in the entire game, right? You'd expect them to have that difference-making running back, and they just haven't had that guy. They tried a couple years ago. They brought in Zack Moss, but he's never finished better than RB51. Earlier this offseason, they tried to go get Duke Johnson, they tried to go get J.D. McKissick before he apparently changed his mind and returned to the Washington Commanders. So they instead signed a consolation prize with Duke Johnson. And then after that, they spent their second round pick, the 63rd overall pick, on James Cook, who many believe is the best receiving back in this year's draft class. And that, my friends, is very, very exciting, particularly from a fantasy football standpoint. Now, what's interesting about this year when you're looking at the Bills' running back room is that Devin Singletary, he's never finished. If you think about Devin Singletary right now, he's at the top of the depth chart, right? He's technically written down as RB1. I've played fantasy football long enough to realize that a lot of times what happens in these scenarios is Devin Singletary's the starter, quote-unquote starter, come week 1. But as the season goes on, James Cook starts eating into that workload, or at least, he's getting the receiving work. And by the end of the season, Devin Singletary seems likely to have faded into irrelevance, whereas James Cook is at least producing in a manner that Devin Singletary was last year, right? Devin Singletary's RB34 finish last year probably feels more like James Cook's floor come the end of the season. Now, what's interesting when you look at how drafts are going to this point, and today is June 27th, 2022, as of right now, Devin Singletary, who has never finished better than RB34, Devin Singletary is being drafted as RB33. He's the 33rd running back off the board in underdog leagues, around pick 107, which is in the 9th round. To me, that doesn't make any sense. James Cook wasn't in the picture before, and he never finished higher than RB34, and now he's being drafted as RB33. Interestingly enough, James Cook is also being drafted in the 9th round, basically alongside of Devin Singletary. And again, like I mentioned, it's likely that Singletary fades as the season goes on, and it's likely that James Cook picks up steam as the season wears on. And what's interesting is James Cook does technically have the 10th best odds of winning Rookie of the Year, which is at least notable when you think about some of the other names that are out there. Now, as for drafting Buffalo Bills running backs, personally, I'm mostly out on both guys, on both Devin Singletary and James Cook. It's interesting because I love James Cook. I really do. I think he's going to be a lot of fun to watch. He's going to be electric with the ball in his hands. But he has already reached a point in summer fantasy football drafts where he's too expensive for me, especially when you consider that he's likely going to be playing behind Devin Singletary to start the season, and this guy's, going for a 9th round pick. Now, I'm fine with James Cook as a player and as a fantasy football option, especially in PPR leagues, and especially if you've tried a 0 RB draft or a superhero RB draft. But he is currently being drafted around some other names that make it really hard for me to take James Cook. So, for example, guys that are drafted in the same range as Devin Singletary and James Cook include Aaron Rodgers, who, that's a whole nother topic, but people are definitely overreacting to Davante Adams not being in town. Aaron Rodgers, Robert Woods, Melvin Gordon, who I would take over both Singletary and James Cook, Zach Ertz, Chase Edmonds, who, stay tuned, I have a Dolphins preview coming out shortly. But there's just a lot of names in that 9th round, in that pick 107 range, that make it really hard to stomach taking committee running backs, even ones with as much upside as James Cook. If I'm forced to choose between the two, I'm going to go James Cook every single time. But all in all, overall, I would say that both guys, Singletary I'm passing on every time. James Cook I'm looking at here and there in the 9th round, but more often than not, I am passing on him for one of those other options. Again, I'm fine with you taking him in the 9th round. Let me grab a drink of beer, and then let's talk wide receivers. This is not an advertisement. Leinenkugels should be listening, but I am currently sipping on a Leinie's Summer Shandy, which you cannot convince me there's a better summer beer. If you're a golfer, there's no better beer for the golf course. Watermelon High Noons, though, those things are great on the golf course. But quick drink, and then we'll get to wide receivers. All right. So, wide receivers. I mentioned to you before that Cole Beasley and Emmanuel Sanders skipped town. They're out. They're out the picture. That frees up, let me do some quick math, 179, and no, I don't have that written down. I had to do the addition myself. That frees up 179 targets. Cole Beasley had 107 last year. Emmanuel Sanders had 72. Again, the Bills added Jameson Crowder, O.J. Howard, and James Cook. All three of those guys are going to get at least some targets. O.J. Howard probably shouldn't be considered in this equation, but he can be a threat in the passing game if used that way. So let's start with Stefan Diggs, the unquestioned wide receiver 1 in Buffalo. And I'll keep this one short because nothing I'm going to say is going to be surprising. None of it's going to be contradictory. None of it is going to be contrarian. I'm all in on Stefan Diggs. Everybody's all in on Stefan Diggs, and they should be. He's played 2 seasons with Josh Allen. He's finished as the wide receiver 3 and the wide receiver 11. He's averaged 20 PPR points per game. He's averaged 16 PPR points per game. He's an unquestioned wide receiver 1. He's the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo. He's a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. There's no denying any of that. He has hit, in last season, he hit 10 or more PPR points in 87.5% of his games. And the year before that, he hit 10 PPR points in every single one of his games. Last season, he had 20 or more PPR points in 25% of his games. The year before that, he did it in 43.7% of his games. And last year, he scored 30 or more PPR points in 6% of his games. Same goes for the year before that. So looking forward to 2022, there's no reason logically that I can think of that would take me off of Stefan Diggs. Yes, they brought in Jamison Crowder. Yes, they brought in James Cook, but Stefan Diggs is still the guy, the number 1 wide receiver. It's going to be his 3rd year in the offense, his 3rd year with that quarterback. He's the wide receiver 1 in Buffalo. He's a wide receiver 1 in fantasy football. Now, he's currently being drafted right around 12th overall, which is the very end of the 1st round, maybe the early 2nd round. He's currently being drafted around 12th overall on DraftKings. He's notably more expensive on Underdog, by the way. Which is interesting because that is a half PPR format, where DraftKings is a PPR format, so you'd think it'd be reversed, where he's more expensive on DraftKings than Underdog, but here we are. I don't make the ADP, I just follow it. But on Underdog, Stefan Diggs is the 4th wide receiver drafted off the board around pick 8, and that at that cost, I'm usually out on Stefan Diggs because guys that go after him include Dalvin Cook and Najee Harris, who I would take over Stefan Diggs in a PPR draft. But around pick 12, usually Dalvin Cook, Najee Harris, those guys are gone, and I am hammering Stefan Diggs at the end of the 1st, early 2nd round. Let's talk Gabriel Davis. Gabriel Davis is one of the most fascinating players in 2022 fantasy football, and let me explain why. First and foremost, I'm in a spot with Gabriel Davis where I'm insanely excited about Gabriel Davis, the football player, and I'm insanely excited about Gabriel Davis statistically from a fantasy football player, while being 99% out on Gabriel Davis in fantasy football in 2020-22. It's a strange dilemma. It's kind of a strange feeling. But the reason to be excited is if you've watched this guy play, or even if you followed him statistically over the last 2 years, you realize, okay, this guy's flashed big playability. He's flashed big time in playing behind Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley and even a little bit of John Brown in 2022. He had 49 of his own targets last year, and even if he's able to siphon a chunk of Emmanuel Sanders' 72 targets that he vacated, so let's assume Jameson Crowder takes over Cole Beasley's targets, and Gabriel Davis is able to take just a chunk of Emmanuel Sanders' targets. There's no question about it. He's going to be taking a gigantic step forward. Now, the problem with that is, and this is similar to Josh Allen, it's similar to Stefan Diggs, it's similar to James Cook, he's being drafted in a way that shows I'm not the only one expecting a breakout. Everybody is expecting a breakout. He is not at all being drafted like a sleeper. He's already being drafted as a wide receiver 2. So currently he's the 24th wide receiver off the board, which is at least fascinating because he does have the 25th best odds of leading the NFL in receiving. In Underdog, he's drafted around pick 49. So if you put that another way, he's already being drafted as a wide receiver 2, a top 24 wide receiver, and he's being drafted in the 5th round. The problem is he's being drafted alongside names like Jerry Jeudy, Terry McLaurin, Allen Robinson, DK Metcalf, Rashad Bateman, Brandon Cooks, Juju Smith-Schuster, Chris Godwin, and that's just wide receivers. I didn't even mention, Darren Waller, George Kittle, Patrick Mahomes, Cam Akers, Breece Hall, Justin Herbert, David Montgomery, Lamar Jackson, J.K. Dobbins. There's just so many names and so many surefire names with similar upside but more of a proven floor that are being drafted around or after Gabriel Davis that it doesn't make a lot of sense to take that gamble on Gabriel Davis. So all in all, I'm super excited about him from a fantasy football standpoint, while also having almost no exposure to him in best ball leagues and in redraft leagues this year. Jameson Crowder, on the other hand, right? He's one of the newest members of the Buffalo Bills. Like I mentioned to you before, Cole Beasley vacated 214 targets over the last 2 seasons. And let's stop and take a look at Cole Beasley himself or his role with the Buffalo Bills, because that's the role that Jamison Crowder is going to be taking over. So Cole Beasley finished as the wide receiver 38 last year, and the wide receiver 27 the year before that in PPR points. He finished he had the 26th most targets last year and the 29th most targets in 2020. He was 18th in the NFL in catches in both seasons. And he was 41st in receiving yards last year and 21st in receiving yards in 2020. Right? So he was definitely effective. He was definitely a weapon as a wide receiver with Josh Allen, as the slot wide receiver with Josh Allen, functioning as a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 during the last 2 years in Buffalo. He's gone. Jameson Crowder is in. He's expected to basically just fill the Jameson Crowder or the Cole Beasley role, and there's definitely an argument to be made that Jameson Crowder is better for the Cole Beasley role than Cole Beasley is for the Cole Beasley role, largely because Jameson Crowder is an exceptionally talented and athletic football player running the slot. Cole Beasley played 30 fantasy football games in the last 2 years. He was able to hit 10 points in 50% of his games and 20 PPR points in 20% of his games. And again, Jameson Crowder is taking over that role. Now, what's interesting is where I told you Gabriel Davis, Stefan Diggs, Devin Singletary, James Cook, Josh Allen, all 5 of those guys are priced incredibly expensive and make it hard for me to draft those guys. Jameson Crowder is the exact opposite. So Jameson Crowder is currently being drafted around pick 129th, which is in the 11th round. He is the 61st wide receiver off the board. And remember, Cole Beasley never finished lower than wide receiver 38 when he was with the Buffalo Bills. And Jameson Crowder is being drafted as the wide receiver 61. Heck, even when he was on the Jets, Jameson Crowder had wide receiver finishes of 54 and 25 when it comes to points per game. 54 and 25. But again, here he is being drafted as the wide receiver 61. So for me, Crowder is basically an auto draft. He's an auto pick in the 11th round. And I think he's one heck of a buy low candidate in dynasty leagues. If you feel like throwing I'll bet you can get him for a third rounder if you're desperate. Not even if you're desperate. If you're just in need for some wide receiver help in PPR leagues, toss out a third rounder and try and get Jameson Crowder in. Now, possible threat there is Isaiah McKenzie. Dark horse threat, long shot threat, but fantasy football is a game of what ifs, right? So on the downside, Isaiah McKenzie, in all likelihood, he's buried. He's not going to get many targets behind Stefan Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Jamison Crowder, Dawson Knox, James Cook. The Bills used their 5th round pick on Khalil Shakir. They brought in O.J. Howard. So in all likelihood, McKenzie's not going to be relevant in fantasy football. And he's being drafted that way. He's the 92nd wide receiver off the board. He goes around pick 18, or around pick 209 in round 18. But still, fantasy football is a game of what ifs. And what if Isaiah McKenzie's able to wrestle that slot role away from Jameson Crowder? And furthermore, Jameson Crowder's only on a 1-year deal. So what if Isaiah McKenzie's able to overcome him and capture that slot role as soon as this year and into next year? You could certainly do a heck of a lot worse for an 18th round dart throw. Okay. Quick drink. We're going to wrap it up with tight ends. And again, so keep in mind here, the Bills lost Cole Beasley, Emmanuel Sanders. That's 179 targets. Brought in Jameson Crowder, brought in O.J. Howard, brought in James Cook. I am out on Dawson Knox. And this one is probably one of the more controversial ones. I know there's a lot of people in on Dawson Knox. He exploded onto the scene last year. He scored 11.13 PPR points per game, which was the 8th most among tight ends. He was the TE8. He played in 14 football games, and he registered 10 PPR points in 42% of those, and 20 PPR points in 14% of those. The problem is that most of his scoring happened on the back of 9 touchdowns, which tied with Mark Andrews and Hunter Henry for the most in football among tight ends. And that's obviously not a bad thing. And it's certainly, it's certainly worth noting that he's a red zone threat and a touchdown threat on one of the highest scoring offenses in football. That's not a bad thing. But when you look at the rest of his statistical output, right, we're talking last year he had 66 targets, which was the 20th most, quote unquote, most amongst tight ends. He had 46 catches, which was the 19th most. And he had 538 yards, which was the 15th most. So you have to wonder if there's some regression in the touchdown column. Will Dawson Knox be able to make up for it in catches? Will he be able to make up for it in yards? In other words, can he continue to sustain 0.64 touchdowns per game with Stefan Diggs, Gabriel Davis, Jameson Crowder, James Cook, and now O.J. Howard in the picture? It's certainly possible. It might be. Remember, the Bills have the 5th pass heaviest offense in football, the 3rd highest scoring offense. But it's not a bet that I'm interested or willing to take around pick 102, which is where he's drafted, which is the 9th round. And part of the reason for that is, the names around Dawson Knox are, Damian Harris, Kareem Hunt, Aaron Rodgers, Robert Woods, Melvin Gordon, and more. It's just not a bet that I'm willing to take. And my general philosophy when it comes to tight ends in redraft and best ball leagues is to either get an elite one, right? Get Travis Kelce, get Mark Andrews, or wait till the double-digit rounds and either, if you're in best ball, stack up on 3 solid tight ends, like Hunter Henry types. And if you're in redraft, sometimes I don't even draft a tight end. If I don't get the elite one, I just don't draft them, and I just stream all season long. So I'm not willing to use a 9th-round pick on Dawson Knox. I'd rather grab one of those running backs or receivers, or if I still need a quarterback, I'll go get my guy Aaron Rodgers there. So everything that we talked about in this last 30 minutes, which, by the way, I thought this was going to take 10 minutes, so there's some tweaking to do, but I appreciate you sticking with me. It's been fun. It's a learning experience, right? This is episode 2. But everything that we just discussed, and frankly, a whole heck of a lot more, there's plenty that I didn't even talk about. It's all in that link that I provided in the description, or again, go to basementbrewedff.com, click content, it'll be right there front and center. And if, once you go to the website, you'll also get hounded to sign up for some emails so you don't miss out on anything in the future. So next up is the Miami Dolphins. I'll be posting that article on Wednesday, and I'll be releasing my fantasy football draft kits next week in July as well. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, seriously, my friend, thank you so much for coming here, joining this conversation, staying in this conversation. It really, really, really means a lot. It means the world. Again, you're helping a guy chase his childhood dream, and that's fact. I could not do this without you. Thank you so much. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, leave a review, and share this with your non-competing friends. Again, thank you so much for being here. Cheers. This brew is for you.